James had been sitting in that hospital waiting room for 6 hours. His daughter was 8 years old and somewhere behind those doors, and nobody had told him anything. Then the woman next to him started crying, quietly, like she was trying to hide it. James didn't think twice. He just handed her his last paper napkin and said, "Whatever it is, you're going to get through it." She looked up at him, and that was the moment James realized he had seen her face before, on his daughter's chart. She wasn't just a stranger. She was the doctor. If this story moves you, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next. James Calloway was the kind of man who showed up. He showed up to work at 5:45 every morning to drive the same school bus route he had driven for 9 years. He showed up to every one of Maya's parent-teacher meetings with a pen and a notepad, and he showed up to every one of her 8 birthdays with a homemade cake that looked a little worse each year and tasted a little better. He was not a man of big words or grand gestures. He was a man of showing up. So when Maya's fever spiked to 104 on a Tuesday night and wouldn't come down, he carried her to Mercy General with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, sat down in the waiting room, and did not move. That was 6 hours ago. The waiting room smelled of floor cleaner and something faintly sweet from the vending machine in the corner, which had 1 bag of pretzels left, hanging crooked from its hook like it had given up. The chairs were hard plastic, molded into a shape no human body actually fit, and the television bolted high on the wall was showing a talk show with the volume too low to hear and the captions half a sentence behind. 3 other people sat scattered around the room, an elderly man with a paper cup of coffee, a young woman staring at her phone, a teenage boy in a soccer uniform fast asleep against the wall. Nobody talked. That was the unspoken rule of waiting rooms. You kept your eyes down and your fear to yourself. He had a drawing in his coat pocket. Maya had made it 2 weeks ago at the kitchen table, her tongue pressed between her teeth, the way it always was when she concentrated. A house with a lopsided sun, 2 stick figures in the garden holding hands, 1 tall and 1 small. She had labeled them Dad and Me in purple crayon, the E in me written backwards, which she refused to fix because she said it looked more interesting that way. James had folded it and slipped it into his pocket the next morning, and he had been reaching for it and letting go all night, not quite ready to hold it, not quite able to stop needing it nearby. A nurse had walked past him twice in the last hour. The same nurse, dark braids, green scrubs, clipboard both times. The first time she glanced at him the way hospital staff glance at waiting family, quick and practiced and giving nothing away. The second time she slowed, just for a half step, and James thought she was going to stop, thought the waiting was finally over. She didn't stop. She kept walking, disappeared through the double doors, and the doors swung shut with a soft mechanical hiss that sounded, to James, like a held breath. His hands tightened into fists without him meaning them to. He was staring at the pretzel bag, not really seeing it, when he became aware that the woman 2 seats to his left was crying. Not loudly, not the open, uncontrollable way fear sometimes forces out of people in waiting rooms. She was crying the way people cry, when they are trying very hard not to. Small and quiet, turned slightly away, shoulders barely moving, breath coming in controlled measures that were just slightly too controlled. She wore a white coat, dark hair pulled back, a stethoscope around her neck. A doctor, James registered distantly, having a hard night, like everyone else in this room. James was not an impulsive man. He thought before he spoke, because raising a child alone had taught him there was no one else to undo the damage if he moved too fast. But there are moments that don't wait for thinking. He reached into his jacket pocket, found a paper napkin from the coffee he had barely touched 4 hours ago, and held it out toward her without a word. She turned, saw the napkin, looked up at his face. "Whatever it is," James said quietly, "you're going to get through it." She stared at him, and something moved across her face he couldn't quite name. Not gratitude exactly, something more complicated than that. Then her expression shifted, and she went very still, studying him the way people study a face they are suddenly not sure they are seeing for the first time. James felt it a half-second later, the same slow recognition, the same cold crawl at the base of his spine. 20 minutes after they had brought Maya through the doors, a doctor had leaned over his daughter's bed, said, "I'll be back," in a voice that gave nothing away, and walked out. He had not seen her again. Not once in 6 hours. He was looking at her now. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The talk show on the television laughed at something nobody in the waiting room heard. The elderly man with the coffee cup shuffled toward the bathroom, and the room felt even emptier without him. James kept his eyes on the woman in the white coat, not staring, just watching the way you watch something you are trying to understand. She had taken the napkin and was holding it in both hands, not using it, just holding it, like it was the only solid thing available. "You're Maya's father," she said finally, her voice steady, in the way voices get steady when a person has been working very hard to keep them that way. James nodded once. "I'm Dr. Elena Marsh," she said. "I'm the one looking after your daughter." James absorbed that the way cold water absorbs into dry ground. He had spent 6 hours wondering who was behind those doors, what they were doing, whether they were scared or confident, or somewhere in between. He had built a version of Maya's doctor in his head, someone certain and unreachable, someone who had answers lined up and ready. The woman holding a paper napkin in a plastic chair did not match that version at all. "Is she okay?" he said. Not is she going to be okay. Not what's wrong. Just the raw two-word question that had been sitting at the front of his throat for 6 hours. Dr. Marsh looked at him steadily. "She's stable right now," she said. "But I need to talk to you about her results. That's actually why I came out here." She paused. "I just needed 1 minute first," she added quietly. 1 minute that wasn't inside those walls. James understood that more than she probably expected. He had learned a long time ago that needing a minute was not the same as falling apart, and that sometimes a minute was the only thing standing between a person and falling apart, and that knowing the difference was its own kind of strength. He didn't push. He just sat the way he sat with Maya during thunderstorms, present and quiet and unhurried, until she was ready. It took about 90 seconds. Then Dr. Marsh straightened, tucked the napkin into her coat pocket, and turned to face him properly for the first time. "Maya's fever is from an infection," she began, "but the blood work flagged something else, something we weren't looking for." James felt the floor shift under him, even though he was sitting down. That was the sentence nobody wanted to hear in a hospital. Something we weren't looking for. It meant the problem was bigger than the door you had walked through. Dr. Marsh explained it carefully, in plain language the way good doctors do, when they understand that fear makes medical terms dissolve before they reach the brain. Maya's immune markers were unusual, not dangerous on their own, but unusual enough that there were 2 possible explanations. One straightforward and manageable. One that would require a specialist and a different kind of conversation entirely. The tests to separate the 2 would take until morning. "So right now," Dr. Marsh said, "we wait." James looked at his hands. He thought about the drawing in his pocket, the backwards E, the lopsided sun. He thought about Maya's stuffed rabbit, the ear more worn than the other, because that was the one she had held since she was 2. He thought about her voice that morning, before the fever climbed, calling him into the bathroom to show him a ladybug on the mirror that she was absolutely certain was the same one from the garden, the one she had named Gerald. He breathed in slowly and breathed out slowly, and he did not cry, not because he was strong, but because he had learned that tears could wait and presence could not. "Can I ask you something?" James said. Dr. Marsh nodded. "When you came out here and sat down, were you scared?" She was quiet a moment, deciding how honest to be, weighing the professional answer against the true one. "Yes," she said. "One of the 2 explanations is something I have only seen twice in my career. I don't like talking to parents when I'm not certain yet. It feels like handing someone a map with half the roads missing." James nodded slowly. "But you came out anyway," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Because you had been out here for 6 hours," she said. "And that's not something you make a person do alone." What neither of them knew yet, sitting in those hard plastic chairs under the fluorescent hum of the waiting room, was that the conversation was not finished. There was something Dr. Marsh had not said yet, something she had found while pulling Maya's file, something that had nothing to do with blood work or test results, something small and handwritten and 3 years old, that was going to change everything before this night was over. If you have ever sat in a waiting room alone, and terrified and trying not to show it, drop a comment below. We are not here to judge. We are here because some things are too heavy to carry, without someone sitting next to you. Dr. Marsh stood up from the plastic chair, and James thought she was going back through the double doors, back to Maya, back to the controlled world where the distance between doctor and father was measured in linoleum and swinging doors. But she didn't go through the doors. She walked to the nurse's station at the far end of the corridor, said something quiet to the woman behind the desk, and came back holding a thin manila folder. She sat down again, not 2 seats away this time, but 1, close enough that James could see her hands were steady now, the trembling from earlier entirely gone, replaced by the stillness that comes not from calm, but from decision. She set the folder on her knee and looked at him. "Before I show you this," she said, "I need you to know, I almost didn't. I almost told myself it wasn't my place." James looked at the folder. It was thin, maybe 4 or 5 pages, the kind that didn't look like much until it was. "What is it?" he said. Dr. Marsh opened it to the last page. It was a photocopy of a handwritten note, 2 lines on a standard patient intake form, the writing looped and slightly hurried. James recognized it immediately, the way you recognize something that lives inside your chest, rather than your memory. His hands started shaking before he finished reading the first line. "Where did you find this?" he said, his voice barely a word at all. "It was in Maya's file," Dr. Marsh said quietly. "Filed under her mother's name, from a routine checkup 3 years ago. Maya's mother, Diane, had been gone for 2 years. She had not been sick when she wrote the note, or at least nobody had known yet, the kind of knowing that comes with a diagnosis and a timeline. She had gone in on an ordinary Wednesday and filled out an intake form the way everyone does, quickly, without ceremony. Somewhere between the checkbox for allergies and the line for emergency contact, she had written 2 sentences in the margin. James read them again, slower, though he had understood them completely the first time. Trust the doctor who stops to listen, not the one too busy to cry. If she ever has to choose alone, that is the one she needs. He sat with those 2 sentences and felt the full weight of them settle into his chest, like something that had always been there and had only just found its right place. Dr. Marsh gave him the time. She did not fill the silence with explanation or professional distance. She just sat beside him in that hard plastic chair at 2:30 in the morning and let him have his moment with his wife's handwriting. After a while he looked up. "She never told me she wrote this," James said. Dr. Marsh shook her head gently. "People write things on forms they never say out loud," she said. "Sometimes it's easier to leave something behind in writing than to say it and make it real." James folded the photocopy carefully, along its original crease, and held it in his lap, on top of the pocket with Maya's drawing, and for a moment, the 2 pieces of paper felt like the same thing from opposite ends of time. "I need to tell you something else," Dr. Marsh said, her voice shifting back into something careful and measured. "When I came out here tonight, I wasn't only taking a minute. I was thinking about transferring Maya's case." James went very still. "Not because of her condition," she said quickly, reading his face. "Because of mine. The second explanation I mentioned, the one I've only seen twice. Both times, I was the attending. Both times, the outcome was not what anyone wanted." She stopped, and the waiting room breathed quietly around them. "I was sitting out here, deciding whether the kindest thing for your daughter was to step away and let someone without that history walk in fresh." James sat with that. He thought about what it cost a person to consider removing themselves from something they were trained to do. because they were afraid their past would make them worse instead of better. He thought about how much it actually took to admit that, out loud in a hospital waiting room, to the father of the child in question. "What made you decide to stay?" he asked. Dr. Marsh looked at him, then down at her coat pocket, where the napkin had disappeared. "You handed me that napkin," she said quietly, "and you told me I was going to get through it. And I realized I was out here trying to protect your daughter from me, when what she actually needed was for me to stop being afraid and go back in that room." James opened his mouth to respond, and that was the exact moment the double doors opened, and the nurse with the dark braids walked out, clipboard in hand, and looked directly at him with an expression that was neither good news nor bad news, but something that sat uncomfortably between the two, and said, "Mr. Calloway, the results are back. Dr. Marsh, we need you inside, now." Dr. Marsh was already moving before the nurse finished the sentence. She stood, smoothed her white coat once with both hands, the same way James had seen Maya smooth her school dress on picture day, a small private ritual, before walking into something that mattered. She looked at James, and for 1 second the doctor was entirely gone, and there was just a person standing there, tired and honest, and carrying more than she had shown him. "Come with me," she said. "Not wait here. Not I will come back and find you. Come with me." James stood up so fast, the plastic chair scraped back against the floor. The corridor beyond the double doors was longer than James had imagined from the waiting room side. Fluorescent lights ran the full length of it, the kind that flattens everything and makes the middle of the night look the same as noon. His shoes made a soft, rhythmic squeak on the linoleum that felt too loud in the quiet. Dr. Marsh walked just ahead of him, with the particular walk of someone who has learned to move through difficult spaces without letting the difficulty show in their body. They stopped outside a door with a small square window. Through the glass, James could see a bed, a monitor, a small shape under a pale blue blanket. His breath left his body and came back changed. "Before we go in," Dr. Marsh said, her hand flat against the door. The results came back as the first explanation, the manageable one. She looked at him directly. "She is going to be fine, James." James put one hand on the wall beside him, not because he was falling, but because the wall was there, and his legs had forgotten what they were for. He had held that sentence at arm's length for 6 hours, the possibility of its opposite pressing against the other side of the door like weather. Fine. She was going to be fine. It was the smallest word for the largest thing. He breathed in and out, and when he looked up, Dr. Marsh was still watching him, steady and unhurried, and he understood that this was simply who she was, that the woman in the plastic chair and the doctor in the corridor were not two different people, separated by a white coat. He pushed the door open. Maya was awake, barely, her eyes at half-mast, the way they got when she was fighting sleep and losing. The stuffed rabbit was tucked under her arm, the worn ear visible against the pale blanket. She turned her head when she heard the door, and her face when she saw him was the same face she had been making since she was 2 years old, when he walked into a room, immediate and total and entirely unself-conscious. "Daddy," she said, in a voice made smaller by the long night and the fever that was already coming down. He crossed the room in 4 steps and sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and she leaned her head against his arm, and James held the side of that hospital bed with one hand and held himself together with whatever was left. After a moment, Maya lifted her head and looked past him toward the doorway, where Dr. Marsh was standing just inside. "You came back," Maya said, with the directness of a child who notices everything and filters nothing. Dr. Marsh smiled, a real one, the kind James hadn't seen from her all night. "I said I would," she replied. Maya considered this carefully. "My mom always said, the ones who come back are the ones worth keeping," she said, then put her head against her father's arm, as if she had said nothing remarkable at all. James felt Dr. Marsh go very still behind him. He didn't look at her. He just reached into his coat pocket and held out the folded photocopy, and she stepped forward, and took it from him quietly. She read it, standing in the soft, monitored light of Maya's room, and when she looked up, her eyes were full again, except this time she didn't try to hide it. She folded the paper along its crease and held it carefully, and James understood without either of them saying a word that she was going to keep it, that it belonged with her as much as it belonged with him, that Diane had written it for both of them, one person who would need to be found and one person who would need to be reminded of why they stayed. Maya was asleep within 10 minutes, her breathing slow and even, the monitor a quiet, steady pulse in the corner. James sat beside her and did not move. Some things you don't rush, some rooms you earn the right to sit in, and once you are there you stay until the staying is done. Dr. Marsh stopped by one more time before her shift ended, stood in the doorway without speaking, and James nodded once and she nodded back, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole story. If this moved you, subscribe and stay close, because every week we bring you another story about ordinary people doing quietly extraordinary things, and not one of them is worth missing.